Hi. Um, I'm going to talk and read a little bit from my novel, The Four Spent the Day Together, which originally I intended to be a true crime book, which would have been my first kind of foray into that genre. Otherwise, I write literary fiction. Literary fiction that comes from observations and extrapolations directly from my own life. I was living in northern Minnesota around 2017 through 2020 in a cabin that my partner and I had bought. We normally lived in Los Angeles, but I saw the cabin in northern Minnesota as a wonderful chance to escape LA and the pressures of LA and just write close to nature in the wilderness. He had been going back and forth with addiction and drinking problems. He saw the cabin as an opportunity to get away and hold down a non-demanding job and drink nights and weekends. While I was there during a semester break, and I should add he was working, his profession was therapy, psychology, and he was working in social services in the main towns of the Iron Range. The Iron Range was an abandoned mining district. The place where the cabin was about 20 miles north. And these were two entirely different worlds. The world of the cabin was cedar and glass and summer homes and people from the cities coming with their families in the summer to enjoy life by the lakes. And the life in the towns of the Iron Range are people living in these kind of ramshackle trailers and old mining company houses that had been abandoned a long time ago. The mines hadn't completely shut down, but they'd automated. Very few people any longer worked in mining. The biggest employer, like a lot of rural America, was actually in health services. But the majority of people didn't really have proper full-time employment at all. They pieced together a living with various part-time jobs. So my partner's job was to see the kids who passed through the social welfare system, of which there were many, a population of people very transient, intermittently homeless, and in and out of foster care all their lives. I read about this crime. We subscribed to the local newspaper. And I read about this intriguing murder. There were plenty of murders up there. I mean, actually, for a rural area, there was an astonishing amount of homicidal violence, I learned later. But what captivated me about this particular crime was first that it involved teenagers and three friends together kidnapping an older acquaintance. And that it was durational. The crime was durational. It wasn't just bang, bang, you're dead in the heat of the moment. They kidnapped him, and the victim had multiple chances to leave during the 24 hours or so that they spent together, and yet didn't. And I got really curious about this. And I wondered what it would be like to reconstruct those 24 hours that these people spent together. I thought of the Michael Haneke movie, Funny Games. I don't know if you've seen that film, about these two preppy killers who terrorize and kidnap a young family, ultimately killing them, playing a series of mind games. I found out soon it wasn't exactly like that. The common thread between this crime and the other crimes up there was methamphetamine. Even more than opioids and fentanyl, meth was really the drug of choice in this area. And what happened was the kids had been smoking meth on and off together all day long. And it ended in this inexplicable, nonsensical walk into the woods at 3 o'clock in the morning where they shot the victim in the head while the accomplice waited in the car. I started to research the crime by going back there in the winter and talking to people. The kids were caught very quickly. I mean, within 2 days, they'd all been arrested, charged, and were in jail. And beginning my research, I reached out to the kids and I formed relationships with them. I started emailing and even visiting them in prison. And eventually, I ended up spending 2.5 years researching this. And I met the thing about a crime, I mean, one of the magical and beautiful things about any crime story is it's just a wedge into reality. You know, it kind of cracks the mundane, routine surface of reality wide open and puts brackets around it just like a crime scene, allowing us to really look at who the people are and what the forces are in the communities and the families that led to the dramatic moment of the crime. So I ended up talking to everybody, the teachers, the cops, the homicide detectives, the families, the friends of the kids, and the kids themselves. But as I started to write the book, I realized I didn't quite have enough to go on. There was something lacking. I guess my two great guiding lights for this book were two historical crime novels. First, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, 1950s Americana in Kansas, and then Norman Mailer's book, The Executioner's Song, which was very much about 1970s America, and that was in Utah. And in both cases, the writers gathered reams of material, and the principal actors and the secondary actors shared the most intimate details of their lives. They knew everybody's loves and affairs and desires and hopes and dreams. They knew enough to really, execute what Truman Capote ended up describing as the nonfiction novel. I didn't have that. The answers to most of my questions to both the kids and their friends, the first answer was like, I don't know. And then the second answer would be, I can't remember. So it was very hard. I realized it was going to be very hard to put together an entire book when I couldn't really get any deeper below the surface of things than this pervasive numbness that seemed to bind together all of the kids. So one thing that happened to me while I was researching this was when I went back to the little town where the crime happened, Harding, Minnesota, walking around in the winter in the alleyways between the houses, looking at the clothes washing lines and the old wrecked cars. I had powerful flashback to the town that I grew up in industrial Milford, Connecticut, near Bridgeport, Connecticut, in a very different time and place, almost 50 years separating my childhood and the childhood of these kids. I'd never written about my childhood. My family emigrated, left the United States when I was in my mid-teens, and I had the rest of my growing up time in New Zealand. And I'd always avoided my family story through the 8 books that I'd written so far. And it occurred to me that maybe the story was not just in the crime, but in the changes in American working class life that had taken place since the years of my parents growing up in the working class Bronx of the mid-20th century, all the way to 2019, when the kids who really didn't go to school at all and were on meth since their early teens committed this crime. So I decided to divide the novel into 3 parts. It was no longer exclusively about the crime. The first part would be about my family history and the town that I grew up in. The second part would be about my partner's addiction and our situation in the countryside in Balsam, Minnesota. And the third part would be about the crime. So I'm going to read 2 parts of the book. One of them concerns my character, Kat, as a 13 or 14-year-old girl, and the other one flash forwards to Brittany, the girl involved in the crime, about the same age. So this is Milford, Connecticut in the late 1960s. When St. Andrew's Church co-sponsored an ecumenical teaching about racial equality and justice, Emma saw it as a chance to reconnect with her older daughter, Catherine. She knew Catherine cared deeply about politics. The main speaker would be Henry Harris Bowen, a brilliant young man from Harlem who just arrived to head up the Bridgeport Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Pleased with herself, Emma bought 2 tickets and planned it as a mother-daughter outing. Finally, she was doing something Catherine would look up to. The auditorium that night at Calf Pen Meadow Elementary was almost 2/3 full, a larger audience than Emma was expecting, frankly, for a meeting of this kind in Milford. Father Luke introduced Rabbi Stein from Beth Shalom, and Rabbi Stein introduced the speaker. Without even thanking the rabbi, Henry Bowen surveyed the all-white audience of Episcopalians and Jews and proceeded to excoriate them. It is a sign, he said, the Black Power movement has finally arrived, when even the most privileged white communities are moved to educate themselves about the bloody racial history of this country and America's systemic absolute oppression of Black and brown people. Bowen went on to present a formidable and heart-wrenching list of facts about Black life in Bridgeport. The child poverty and illiteracy, the racist NIMBY opposition to school busing, the shocking overcrowding of families in substandard housing, and the historical exclusion of Black workers by the Irish-led trade unions. A stunned hush descended on the room when he finished speaking. Finally, Rabbi Stein asked if there were any questions. To her own surprise, Emma stood up. "What you described," she said, "well, it's just terrible. I sympathize with your plight, and I'm ashamed of Bridgeport, but, well, is there anything we here in Milford can do to help? What are your suggestions?" "Lady," he said, "we're not looking for your sympathy, and we don't need your help. That's the whole problem with white liberals. They are so full of sympathy. We're talking about Black power and autonomy. We're talking about some deep systemic change here." Even Kat was shocked. Sitting down, blushing furiously, Emma wondered if her stepfather, Pat Kelly, had been right when he ridiculed her for collecting money for war orphans and the children of striking coal miners. "What are you?" he'd scoffed. "The Lady Bountiful? These people don't give 2 shits about you. Everyone looks out for themselves and maybe their families, and anyone who pretends otherwise is gaming you. If you were as smart as you think, you'd hold on to your money." What had happened to America? Nothing new. But to Emma, it had become almost unbearable. That summer, Kat found a job harvesting tobacco on one of the small farms out by Wheeler's Farm Road. The only American worker on site, Kat took her place in the fields among a group of men who'd been brought up from the Dominican Republic. The men taught her how to chop and top the tall tobacco plants. By the 3rd or 4th day, she was picking fast enough not to get fired. After work, they gathered in the bunkhouse to drink wine, play guitars, even sing. This seemed like an excellent opportunity to learn Spanish. Maybe she could move to Mexico or Cuba. Friends from the church spotted Catherine after work with her thumb out on the roadside. Instead of confronting Catherine again, Emma decided to pick her up after work. When she arrived at the farm, a foreman led her to the bunkhouse, where she saw her barely teenage daughter sitting cross-legged on the floor with a room full of single men drinking cheap red wine out of jelly glasses. This was too much. Was Catherine trying to get raped? For the first time since she could remember when, Emma dared to be parental. "Catherine, get your pay. You coming home with me right now?" Okay. Then, flashing forward to Brittany's adolescence in Harding, Minnesota, almost 50 years later, she's in her bedroom on her phone. "Do you cheat?" Justin Cole messaged Brittany. Her name on Live Me was Cherry, from his mom's basement in Biwabik. "No, but I work." "What you mean? What kind of work?" "Duh, what kind of work do you think we're talking about?" Brittany thinks. but instead she texts back, I blow glass, which she actually does. She has a friend with a bench and a blowtorch. I'm a personal care attendant, a thing she'd set up with her grandma Dee, 140 a week from the state, which of course they would split. And I also sleep with people for shit. Oh, if we were together, would you do that knowing you're with me? Justin Cole wants to know. Clearly, he doesn't mean personal care. What is his point? Does he think they're dating? I would let you know, but cash is cash to me, she texted back, and then shut down the app. This guy seemed even more stupid than most. Misty was gone, and she was alone, restless and anxious. She tried calling her boyfriend Micah's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She wondered where he was now and what he was doing. What you doing? She messaged. Maybe he was home in the basement of Crystal and Quentin's new house 2 blocks away, where he'd set up his room. The Wi-Fi there wasn't great. A half hour later, Micah messaged her back. Everything good. Sorry, phone died. I figured. The 20 Brad gave me fell out of my pocket, and now I can't re-up until tomorrow. He was messaging from his room, a twin bed and blankets pushed up against the cold cellar wall to turn it into a sofa. He had his mom's gun that she kept in a brown paper bag on the fridge and his own black nylon holster. I'm having the worst day. I'm sorry, love. I just really want to shoot someone. It's a figure of speech. It doesn't alarm her. Micah is a wannabe thug. Part of him truly believes he's on the verge of being recruited to join the Minneapolis branch of the Gangster Disciples, but he also calls himself Pineapple Man from the dumb stoner movie he watched with his biological dad when he was 8. That can't be your go-to every time you're upset. Micah, Brittany knows, is an innocent soul. He'd do anything in the world to protect his siblings and mom, but it helps the anger go away. Yeah, so does sex. True, but you're grounded. Upstairs, Crystal and Quentin were watching TV with Micah's younger siblings, Paisley and Zeke, and his baby half-sister, Cheyenne. Micah's family had split almost in half when his mom and ex-stepdad, Pete King, divorced a year ago. Pete had moved back to the cities with his new fiancée, Crystal's former best friend, and the 2 other kids he and Crystal had. Micah couldn't be bothered going upstairs, so he messaged Crystal, his mom. I'm having Brittany come over. Everyone can criticize, but I love her. Nothing came back. And she makes me happy. He waited a moment, then typed, and I need happy right now. I'm getting really depressed. It's okay if she makes you happy, Crystal replied. You got 2 G's, Micah asked his mother. Yeah. Can I sell it? Pause. Give you the money? Yeah, I guess. Later that night, when her parents were in their converted garage drinking with some of her dad's friends, Brittany slipped out and walked to Micah's house. They hung out and smoked weed with his mom and Quentin and his sister Paisley. When Brittany left to walk home at 1, everyone at Micah's was still up, except for the baby, Cheyenne. So, yeah, it's definitely a tale of 2 generations. I guess one of the things that I was trying to bring out the most in this book was a kind of devolution of American working class life over these 50 or 60 years to the point where, I mean, I don't even know if you can call it working class anymore so much as underclass. The character who Crystal is based on impressed me enormously. She was 39 years old. She had 8 children. She had her first child at the age of 16. And she was like a Fagin character from Dickens when it came to her children's survival. She knew every scam. I mean, if Crystal's intelligence had been applied in other ways, she could have been running a corporation. She was, collecting multiple disability payments. She was selling weed on the side. She had all of these different operations and scams running to support her family. So I was really struck by the intelligence and the tenacity of people living in these extreme, just impossible situations. I mean, before judging these people on the surface of things by reading the newspaper reports, it was so interesting to probe a little bit deeper into what their actual life circumstances were, what their loyalties to each other were, what their values were. But I really like questions, and I wonder if we have just enough time for a couple of questions.
Please stand to ask your question and wait for a microphone to come to you. We have one in the front row.
How do you get people in these circumstances to be honest with you about their lives and let you into their lives like this?
Yeah, it was really difficult. And I was at it for 2.5 years. The first summer, I didn't get very far. But the second part of the novel that I didn't talk very much about was about my character's partner, Paul, who suffers from addiction. And that really turned out to be a bridge to those families. When I started disclosing my own relationship to addiction and the presence of addiction and drug and alcohol problems in my life, that automatically created a kinship between us in a way. And they felt less that I was an outsider judging them or asking superficial questions. And we were able to connect on a much deeper level. I mean, including with the kids' families. You know, I had a great relationship, actually, with the boy Deshaun's mother, Crystal. We talked 6 or 7 times, and with Brittany's parents. So that, you know, the shared experience of addiction was really the bond. Anyone else?
With the victims' families as well, were they annoyed or upset that you were speaking with the perpetrators?
They were a little more guarded than the families of the perpetrators, but they did talk to me. I mean, they definitely wanted their side of the story told. And that was a tricky line to walk. I mean, as much as I understand the mitigating circumstances in the kid's life, it doesn't excuse the death of this older person, Josh, 34 years old, who had a family, who had a life, who had just as much to a life as these kids. So it was a tricky line to walk. But I talked especially with his dad, who was like utterly destroyed and heartbroken by the crime. The family had split. The mother was more middle class and moved down to the cities, and the kids moved with her. The dad and his son, the victim, stayed on the Iron Range, and the dad's life was really destroyed by this. And I had several really warm, deep conversations with the dad.
Chris, can you talk more about how you put yourself into your books, this book and earlier books, and the project of writing yourself into these stories?
Yeah. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem that remarkable. Maybe because I started out my writing life as a journalist and a newspaper reporter. So I've always seen writing as a kind of reportage, you know, fiction writing as reportage on a very high level that goes very deep. So I'm always present in the books. People use the word autofiction, and I completely reject that because I never really see myself as the subject in the books. My character is there as an anchor or a guide, but it's the journey and what my character is seeing and witnessing and, observing and understanding is really the heart of the book, not anything to do with the character itself.
Hi, thank you so much. You mentioned a term, pervasive numbness. We've been talking in our own group about the changes in generations and having a lot to do with the economic situation and the workforce situation. Can you tie in that concept to these changes in the workforce and that you're seeing in classes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the book starts out with my character's parents' generation, in the Bronx in the first half of the 20th century, and they're studying Latin and Greek in the public high school. By the time we get to 2019, the kids don't have to go to high school at all. They just opt for the, quote, online option that's supposedly supervised by the completely drug-addicted parents. And the system has completely defaulted on its responsibility to provide an education for these kids. So yeah, the numbness. The drugs certainly are a huge part of this, and methamphetamine is such a scary and dangerous drug. But the degree to which people are just really, on the one hand, hyper aware because there's so much danger that they face all the time, but on another level, completely checked out. I would say checked out on the level of one's ability to affect a change in the situation. I mean, people have long since given up on that, but definitely checked in on the level of emotional sensitivity to what's happening, because they have two bandwidths. There's numb, and then there's the explosion of rage and emotion and grief. I mean, there's really kind of, as I observed it, there were really only two emotional states and nothing in between. And one of them was blank, and one of them was just, fire alarm level agony.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. Earlier today, somebody had said that fiction is like a wedge into reality, and I know one of my favorite books, Beloved by Toni Morrison, is also based on a news article that she read. And I'm curious to know, how, as you're looking at the news, how does this inspire you to write based on the fact that this writing is based on a real story?
Yeah, that is really such an interesting and important question. There's a big difference between writing fiction and writing journalism, and writing fiction means, I think, getting behind what people say. This part of the country called the Iron Range, the first time that Trump won in 2016, hordes of journalists descended on the Iron Range because it was one of the bellwether areas of the country that had changed from a Democratic bastion to majority Trump, overwhelming majority Trump, almost overnight. But the journalists only stayed 3 or 4 days. They only stayed long enough to get the most superficial quotes, and then they have to move on to the next story. And fiction doesn't do that, Fiction tries to go deeper behind what people say to what they're actually thinking and feeling, because people do not often express themselves, completely truthfully in the first round of questioning. So yeah, the idea of fiction is to kind of take a real situation and look at it in a much deeper and truer and organic way. Thank you. Time's up. Thank you very much.